Who forgot for the vlog again today? Me. Who forgot to vlog again today? Me. As usual, another sunset. Sunset because I love the winter sunset. So good, so good, so good, y'all. So good. So today's gonna be one of those chatty video because I didn't leave the house and I don't want to because I'm still uploading a lot of new prints to society6.com/ballerine. And also a shout out to whoever bought my my art today in a pillow form. I hope you enjoy it. What shall I talk about? Actually, might talk about this. Yeah, Destiny of the Soul. It is so dusty. But let's talk about this. So there are two books. This is like the sequel of a different book. So I bought this book first. I read this book first. It's basically a story of, if you can read it, you know, an entry that heard of the spirit world, enter the heart of the spirit world. It's like people who basically, what happens with people when they put under hypnosis, and then in that hypnosis people recalls what they do in between lives, meaning like, you know, what happens when you're not alive, when you're not in the body. So what happens after death from your last life and before this life as well. So that's what that book's about. That's basically like case study after case studies of these patients from this hypnotherapist, Michael Newton, PhD. That's the guy who did all these studies. And that book is basically explaining how there are a certain hierarchy within, you know, not hierarchy, but I guess like a system is definitely in place regardless of ethnicity, regardless of where you're from. A system is in place when you passed on into the next lives. And he found out, you know, even after case by case basis, that is pretty systematic, is pretty much the same. The patients are telling him the same things. And so this book is about what happens when you are in the heaven, basically in heavens. And I'm using that word heaven very, very lightly, just because not necessarily heaven, it's just like the spirit world. And the first book is basically exploring a very immediate effect of after death. So this one is more about like what's actually happening after you moved on from the immediate effect of death. And you know, there's a lot of just exploring what you do in between lives. You go either study with people to learn how to create new lives in different planets, and it's a lot of things that I think like not really for the mainstream for sure. But I entered reading the book with an open mind. I started reading it like a long time ago, maybe like 10 years ago or something. And you know, I think you have to read it to sort of get the gist of what the book is. But if you do believe in what these people are saying in the case studies, it shows you that you have, you know, a primary relationship in the family, and you also have like maybe like a second degree relationship, a third degree acquaintanceship, and those degrees in the spirit world, meaning that you are probably distant and it's not part of your soul group. That kind of talk. I know like this particular chat right now is quite specific and it's very niche, and for me to be able to articulate it properly, maybe some people actually do need to have some prerequisite background in regards to this topic. But I'm gonna power through. And you know, these soul connections are not necessarily reflected in your direct bloodlines in life. So you can be like you know, you can be a child to couple that is like third degree soul group, that basically like you basically only an acquaintance in the spirit realm, and you are entering the earth as their child, for example, to learn or like to just repay something from the previous lives that you played together. So if so it can be felt in this life that the distance that you felt is actually very it's very accurate, because like you're not meant to be close, because they're not really part of your primary soul group. So it's like that kind of explanations included in the book. And I think if you're into past lives, if you're into karmic debt and all that things, this particular book is pretty good explaining it from or exploring it, not necessarily explaining it, but like exploring it from a scientific perspective, although it is quite case by case study learning ways. So there's that. But I think like the most important bit for me is just to learn that it's not only one person that says all of this, because there are so many case studies up until this book. In this book, it's like assume that there is a life after death, right? In the first book, you sort of like have to adjust to get there. You sort of have to like get there to the idea of it. You have to sell it. You have to make sure like each person sort of like tell their stories. So that is the first book. And this book like is already is an assumption, it's a done deal. We are moving on to what actually happened in the spirit world. So there's not a lot of trying to convince the audience or the reader on this case about like the existence of the spirit world, because it's assumed that if you're on book 2 that you're already like, okay, I'm on board with this idea. So that's how I'm gonna proceed from here on in to talk about it. Just in case someone's just like came in halfway and just skipped the YouTube video, I'm talking about this book right now. New case studies about life between lives. And it actually really helped a lot. Well, I already like when it comes to the process of grieving people who have passed away, because I already have a very, very strong belief anyway about life after death. Like I just believe that our awareness, our sentientness, what it is that makes us human, which is like our awareness of us being alive, is always going to be preserved after even we are gone from the body. So I'm never really a big worrier about death. Like I'm just worried about the fact that how am I gonna live in a very, very non-regretful way. That's probably much more my concern. Like how can I live in my fullest, or like when I die I'm like, finally death, I love you, come to me death, because I sincerely do believe there are always going to be life after death, and it's not the end. Which is probably why, like, if I ever have like thought of suicides or thought of killing myself, that always prevent me. And that your belief is true to yourself, is right for yourself, and is real for yourself, when that that's a really good point of like, as soon as you have a suicidal thought, you just like reminding yourself, no mate, remember, it's not the end, and death is not the end. Because of this book, I basically, when I go through the depression part of like the darkest part of my depression episode recently, this past half a decade, that I basically told myself, remember that life doesn't end. And you remember the fact that because they deal with what happens with suicide as well, like how they deal with suicide from in the spirit world, if you believe in these things. So we are going ahead under the presumptions that you actually believe, okay? So if you don't believe, it's fine, just hold that belief and put it like aside somewhere first, because the continuance of this particular talk is based on the fact that you do believe on it. So just pretend that you do believe and click play again. So like you know, every time I had that thought, you know, it reminds myself, it's actually a good influence, because it reminds myself, hey man, it's not the end, you know. Suicide is not the end, because what happens is with suicide, based on these books and this series of the book, is that the spirit of the person who committed suicide is basically being retracted back to the spirit world, and then they're presented with, you know, options of, not options, but like what the life possibilities are, like if they stayed alive, you know, the possibilities of what could happen, like how they could actually die if they didn't commit suicide, what kind of life they could have had. So they're given that those particular options and possibility to see, and they also check in with the souls and what kind of souls they are. And there are also some souls that basically like, oh fuck, you know, basically after they committed suicide realize like, oh shit, this is so this is stupid, like I didn't think clearly and now I've seen clearly, and they actually decided from the spirit standpoint to go back to a very similar circumstances that they actually just left, to, you know, sort of like go through and remind themselves again through a particular human life of what they wanted to experience as a spirit. So what usually happens is, in a suicide case, is like they usually go back to a very similar circumstance of their previous life that they left when they commit suicide, and so that they can deal with that particular situation again in the real in the human life. And then they sort of like try to do it again after, you know, after several lives, to gain that kind of strength, because I think like most people go into a human life with an intention, and the intention is not like very specific, like I want to make this kind of, you know, this particular accomplishment in this particular human life. In most cases the intentions are very, very subtle. It's like, I want to gain strength in this particular life, I want to gain courage in this particular life, I want to cultivate my kindness in this particular life. So it's very generic, but because like as you go up the rung of spiritual values, it's very generic. It's like when it comes to almost like they sort of touch about beings that have not ever incarnate as a physical being, and when you talk to these beings, the beings basically only resonate love, unconditional pure love. And when it comes to the point, the end point of all existence is, in the book anyway, because I'm talking about the book here, it always comes back to that, like to, it's all at the end is about love. Every other lessons that exist that we name, anger, jealousy, hatred, you know, every other things, every other emotion that colored our life are just a different shade of love. And when you sort of like take away all those shades, and when you sort of like peel back everything, even at the very, very darkest spectrum of emotions, it's always going to boil down to love. And I feel like that's regardless whether what you read, what kind of books you read. Like if you read the Seth material, for example, so if you're into esoteric books, new age books, if you read Abraham Hicks books, like very, very detailedly, Abraham Hicks not so much, but if you read Seth materials, you know, the Seth, you know, Sarah Jane Roberts books, and also if you read like the mystery schools books, basically, if you know what the mystery schools are, like, you know, the Egyptians mystery schools and everything like that, it will mention it at one point, and it will always mention that life is the key, because that's what it always comes down to. I'm talking about it from a very, very academical level, I guess, like a very mind intellectual sort of pinpoint. I'm not saying intellectual and as if that, you know, I'm better, blah blah blah, no, but I mean like just more like a thought process, like a thought deconstruction, so that we can actually explore it and discuss it, and like, you know, have an idea of what it is that is being talked about, so that it can be laid out and, you know, be consumed. So yeah, the sun is setting as I'm saying this, by the way, so that's why it's getting darker and darker right now. I'm doing this one take. Oh, this is what happens. Also, yeah, when it comes to that, like going back to the book is very, very, it's very helpful, especially for me, because once you realize, you know, that death is an illusion, that, you know, There is no need to sort of make death a big deal, because the soul is not limited to the body. And as much as, so the downside of this is, of course, after reading this, because like once you start to know something, unless you have amnesia, you can't not unknow it, you can't unlearn something. It's hard to unlearn something. Let me retract that. Yeah, it's hard to unlearn something. You can unlearn something, but it takes a lot of time. And there are a lot of things, like in this particular case, where you learn something, you really don't want to unlearn it, because it's actually very important. And I find it to be the truth for me personally, and I don't want to unlearn it. So let's get that out of the way. You can't unlearn it, but now what I find a bit difficult to live with is the fact that once you've seen this perspective, which is a bigger picture perspective from like even a beyond life, your perspective about death changed. But at the same time, but because your perspective changed, your attitude changed, and because your attitude changed, you are no longer normal with your peers, because your peers might have a very different belief about death, have a very different rituals, have a very different ceremonies, might have like put more importance on the on other people and what the culture sees them as. But because I see myself as an individual person, and I have a different beliefs when it comes to deaths concept, which is like it's eternal, so the person themselves are okay, because for me, like the personalities are the spirits, and the spirits when the body dies is basically, you know, just move on. They don't really suffer pain, they don't have this thing. So it puts me into a very odd situations, I guess, because as much as I grieve when people die, as much as I feel the pain when people die, like I can feel like the experience of grief, of loss in my body, because it is a physical sensation. In my mind, I understand what is happening, so my sadness and my experience is completely different than other people in general. So I feel like that is a very weird situation to be in, because I actually have to put up with on top of the grief that I have to deal with, I actually have to put up with the judgment of other people, of like, why is she not reacting the way I expect them to react, you know? Because when you deal with, you know, death, a lot of people romanticize death, you know, like, oh, things would be better if someone didn't die, if things would be a lot better, you know. There's a lot of things that so good about another person, because, you know, when someone died, for example, you know, suddenly they become being put on a pedestal, and then, like, you know, suddenly all the good qualities are the ones that are being talked about. You know, people completely forgot, like, if someone were actually an asshole, for example. It's sort of like a taboo thing, like, you don't talk ill about the dead. But let's be honest, like, they're still a person, right? When they die, they're still a person. Because let's face it, like, you know, when Osama bin Laden died, the whole America basically, not the whole America, but most of the Americas and the world basically cheered about this death. So when you hate someone, death is celebration. But I don't think that's how we treat people in our lives, the people in our lives, that way. Because, like, maybe where Osama lived, you know, it's such a complete different, you know, complete different situation altogether. So I guess, like, if you are dealing with deaths, and if you're in the kind of like after a year or two, sort of like still grieving but have your sanity intact, that kind of, this book is probably going to help you. And if you are a reader too, if you're not, maybe you can just download an ebook or something, so you know, you can just listen to it. It really helps. It also gives you a very different perspective, and even if you don't believe it, you can always research other books, you know, like the Seth materials, because the more I learn about it, like, I learned about it a long time ago, but after I learned about it, after books basically saying the same thing, my infatuation with the academic word, with the literature words, forced me to accept that, okay, this is it. And it also helped with the fact that I already believed in it in the first place. So but yeah, so that's my quick long chatty rants about the book. I'll show you again, Destiny of the Soul by Michael Newton. So they're pretty good if you are dealing with spirituality crisis or death in your family or death in your life right now, or considering death as part of, like, you know, a way out. If you're sick and then you don't have any capacity to live anymore, that, you know, sometimes I think, like, you know, death is not a bad idea in that sense. You know, if you're basically paraplegic and then if you don't have any functionality, you're practically brain dead, you know, there's always going to be situations like that. But I'm not saying that, you know, that's okay, because it's always going to depend on your situation. But that's me. I am thankful for you to listen to my rant. The sun has set and it's time for me to leave. I hope this one is useful, and I'm sorry again. Well, no, I'm no longer going to be sorry. This is gonna be a very regular occurrence in in this vlog, this very low quality light. Bye everyone, thanks for listening to me today, appreciate it. Bye. Isn't it pretty? We are going to end today's vlog with these pretty sunsets. Yay!